Welcome back. Natalie here again from the DNR Outdoor Adventure Center with part 2 of your Sea Lamprey program for the Michigan Fisheries Education Initiative. Thanks for joining me again, and I hope you enjoy the second half of this program. In the second part of our program, we'll answer the following questions. How did the sea lamprey get from its native range in the Atlantic Ocean to our Great Lakes? What damage has the sea lamprey caused to the Great Lakes and the fish, the ecosystem, and the economy that the Great Lakes supports? And also, what is being done currently to control and manage sea lamprey here in the Great Lakes? We already said that sea lamprey are native to the Atlantic Ocean. They entered Lake Ontario first through the St. Lawrence River, as shown here on the map. However, there was a natural barrier that kept them from entering Lake Erie and the rest of the Great Lakes. They were established in Lake Ontario by the 1800s, but were kept there by a natural barrier, which was Niagara Falls. However, when the Welland Canal, shown by that arrow on the left, was built to connect Lake Ontario and Lake Erie so that ships could bypass Niagara Falls, sea lamprey entered the rest of the Great Lakes through that canal. Phases of the Welland Canal were built in the 1800s, but it was improved and completed by the 1920s when sea lamprey were first found in Lake Erie. As shown on this image on the right, sea lamprey quickly spread to the rest of the Great Lakes so that they were in all of them by 1938. The image here on the left shows a commercial harvest of lake herring, another valuable commercial fish species, from Lake Erie in 1918, which was before sea lamprey got into the Great Lakes. So that is what a lot of commercial fishery harvests would have looked like at that time. We've already met the lake trout, shown in the picture on the right, which was another very, very valuable fish at that time as well, both for the fishing economy and for the Great Lakes food web. After sea lamprey got into the Great Lakes, numbers of lake trout dropped to just a fraction of what they were because of sea lamprey killing the lake trout. How do you think that would have impacted the food web and the fishery? So let's look at an example. The line graph here shows lake trout and sea lamprey numbers in Lake Superior and how they changed over several decades. The red line shows the number of lake trout and the blue line shows the number of sea lamprey. Those numbers are labeled on the y-axis, circled here in purple. And it's actually in the thousands. So the 300 that's at the top of the y-axis actually means 300,000 fish. The year is labeled on the x-axis along the bottom. So let's do some quick practice reading this graph. Can you tell what the highest number of lake trout is that the graph shows? What is the highest number of sea lamprey that the graph shows? Remember, you're looking at the red line for lake trout and the blue line for sea lamprey. I'll give you a couple seconds. So here's the answers. For lake trout, it's about 265,000 fish in the year 1935. And for sea lamprey, it's about 275,000, circled there, in about the year 1960. You can see from the red and blue lines that when sea lamprey numbers were the highest, lake trout numbers were the lowest. But as the graph continues and the blue line of sea lamprey stays flat, the red line does start to go up again, showing that lake trout numbers do go up once sea lamprey are controlled. So what are some of the actual numbers associated with sea lamprey damage to our fish in the Great Lakes? A single sea lamprey is capable of killing 40 pounds of fish in its life. Sea lamprey killed about 100 million pounds of Great Lakes fish annually, so every year at their peak. The commercial fishery catch dropped to only 2% of what it had been before sea lamprey were introduced to the Great Lakes. Thousands of fisheries-related jobs were lost at that time, and ways of life for thousands of people were changed because of the introduction of these sea lamprey. So what's being done to control these invasive species? Well, currently there's 3 methods being used: barriers, traps, and lampricide chemical treatment. And also a 4th method that's currently being tested, which is using sea lamprey pheromones to control their movements. Let's take a look at how each one of these methods works. Barriers located at dams stop sea lamprey from moving upstream to their spawning areas. So these target sea lamprey as adults. The lamprey would be moving in this direction, but they can't jump over the dam and they get trapped there. Other fish species that would be migrating upstream to spawn can jump over the barrier, so the barrier does not bother them. The fishway at the Brule River in Wisconsin is a trap and sort barrier. Non-jumping fish, including sea lamprey, are trapped in the fishway. Non-lamprey fish are released upstream on the other side of the dam, and the lamprey are removed. Other migratory fish species are able to swim through the fishway, but sea lamprey are not powerful enough to do that. There are also other types of traps that are not located at dams. These ones target juvenile sea lamprey after they leave the river sediment as they swim downstream, headed for lakes to feed on large fish. So all of the sea lamprey that you see in this trap here in the photo on the right have been caught before they get the chance to feed on a fish. Scientists also use chemical control for sea lamprey in places where they know that there are young juvenile sea lamprey burrowed in the sediment. Lampricide is a pesticide with a chemical called TFM that targets sea lamprey when they are juveniles buried in the river sediment. The way it works is, compared to other types of fish, sea lamprey have very low levels of an enzyme that would get TFM out of their bodies, which makes it toxic to the sea lamprey much more than it is to anything else that is living in the river. There is another type of technique that is currently being tested to control sea lamprey, which is luring them to bad spawning areas or away from good spawning areas. For that, scientists are experimenting with sea lamprey pheromones and alarm cues. A pheromone is a chemical released by an animal to communicate with other animals of the same kind. For example, scientists could use male lamprey pheromones to attract females to bad spawning areas or places where eggs won't survive. The female in the photo here on the left is one that's being used in an experiment. See how it has a tag on its back, which is circled in the photo. Or scientists could use alarm cue chemicals, which lamprey use to communicate danger to other sea lamprey. If scientists release the alarm chemical in a good spawning area, they could keep lamprey away from it. Basically, lamprey can be pulled into bad spawning areas or pushed out of good spawning areas. This next video, produced by the Great Lakes Fishery Commission, shows a lampricide control program taking place up in northern Michigan. Before starting any kind of sea lamprey control program, scientists need to know where the sea lamprey are, right? So they do surveys. They would want to know where sea lamprey are spawning and also where juveniles might be burrowed in sediment. Then the scientists can figure out which control method that we've already looked at might be good for that location. So let's just take a quick look to see what sea lamprey numbers are like here. Because remember that the closest Great Lake to us is Lake Erie. And looking at this graph showing sea lamprey numbers in Lake Erie, the numbers are much higher than they should be. So this is where they actually are right here. So around 20,000, but the target is more like right here. So that's where the numbers should be, and that's less than 10,000. So what's going on around here where sea lamprey numbers are so much higher? So let's say that scientists are looking for locations where sea lamprey might be spawning. Where might they start? They would start by finding which locations have the right spawning conditions that might attract the sea lamprey. Those conditions are having a gravel bottom where the gravel are greater than 9 millimeters in size, like you see in the picture there on the right. There should be a steady current that goes in one direction only. And the water flow velocity should be between 0.5 and 1.5 meters per second. And the water temperature should be between 10 degrees Celsius and 26 degrees Celsius. So if scientists can pinpoint some of the locations with these conditions, that would be a good place to start a survey for sea lamprey. So to figure out why sea lamprey numbers are so high in Lake Erie, scientists have done some surveys to try and figure out where the sea lamprey are spawning around here in the Huron-Erie corridor, which is the area shown on the map here. They use something called acoustic telemetry. They basically put a little tag inside of an adult sea lamprey. Now imagine that this fish here in the picture is actually a sea lamprey. This here would be the tag that they put inside of it. And every time the lamprey swims past a receiver that is in the Detroit River, the receiver pings. This is a picture here showing a receiver. So that would ping every time a lamprey swims past it that has a tag in it. So scientists are able to track the sea lamprey movement to see where they go to spawn. The red line that you see in this map here is actually showing the movement of a sea lamprey. And each red dot is where a receiver got a ping from a lamprey. So let's just take a look at a couple of the movements of sea lamprey that were trapped and tracked during this study. The sea lamprey were trapped down in the Toledo area. So down south of here, where I'm drawing a little circle, so farther south than that. And then they were released with the little tags in them. So let's see where they went to. So watch the red line that shows the movement of the sea lamprey. Okay, so that one
stopped its movement just at the end of the Detroit River, just before getting to Lake St. Clair. Let's look at a different one. See, bear with me here. Now that one moved all the way through the Detroit River and through Lake St. Clair and up into the St. Clair River. Let's look at just one more. That one did about the same thing, moving up through the Detroit River, through Lake St. Clair, and into the St. Clair River.
So for this study, 27 sea lamprey were tagged and their movements were tracked. Almost all of them moved up to the St. Clair River for spawning. So, where do you think scientists might start a control program? If you're thinking the St. Clair River, then yes, it is thought that the sea lamprey spawning in the St. Clair River might be the reason there are so many sea lamprey in Lake Erie these days, because that's very close to the St. Clair River as the lamprey swims. So we've explored a lot about sea lamprey. We've looked at their fascinating biology, how they got to the Great Lakes, the damage that they cause to our fish species, and what's being done in the Great Lakes region and even locally here in the Detroit River and the Huron-Erie corridor to learn more about sea lamprey and control them with appropriate techniques. So the last part of your program, I've got some activities that are interactive, give you some opportunities for critical thinking about some of the research and research techniques surrounding sea lamprey, and just gives you an opportunity to dive a little bit deeper into some of the real data from sea lamprey research. So thanks again for joining me for the sea lamprey program in the Michigan Fisheries Education Initiative.